Okay, we talked a little bit about the structure of stories. Before we get to application, I would like to explain a little something about how an author chooses to picture his characters. I wrote it here on the PowerPoint. You have two ways of characterizing one of your people that you describe. A direct way and an indirect way. For example, I can say, he's lazy. That's a direct description of that person. He's lazy. Or indirectly, I describe he's lazy. I say, he never does the dishes, he always sits and doesn't do anything. I didn't say he's lazy, but I describe his character as lazy. So you have the direct way and an indirect way. First about direct. For example, you find physical descriptions in the Bible. What do people look like? This is a little different than, for example, Dostoevsky or any other, especially the Russian authors. They love to go on, and you can picture perfectly the room. The wash line that was hanging in the room, the windows that were half open, dust that collected on the windowsill. You don't find that in the Bible. Any description of a character, of a physical trait, always serves the plot. For example, we know that Absalom had very long hair. Why is that important? Well, it serves the plot. One, we know he was very concerned about his appearances. Also, we know that finally he gets stuck with his hair on a tree. So it's significant. We know that Sarah was very beautiful. Why is that important? Well, it serves the plot. So anytime it serves the plot, the author can mention what someone looks like. Otherwise, we don't know. We don't know how to picture these people. Sometimes we get these descriptions, and then we know that it serves the plot. So it characterizes a person as soon as the author says, she was very beautiful. That's, for example, I'm thinking about another example. Joseph has this robe with stripes. I don't know if you want to call it stripes, however you interpret it. But the fact that we know that serves the plot, because his brothers are jealous because of this robe. Finally, this robe is ripped up, dipped in blood, sent back to the father. It serves the plot. That's why we know about it. We know that Bathsheba was very beautiful. It serves the plot. So here we have a direct description of the physical appearance of someone. You can also have a direct description of someone's inner life. Being anxious. Here in this one, in this verse, in the chapters that we're reading, it says that the servants were afraid to tell David that the child died. So here we have a direct description, not just saying the knees of the servants were knocking, it just says the servants were afraid. So we have here a description of the servants. Then another very important way of describing a person is the way someone is named. For example, in the book of Ruth, several times that Ruth is mentioned, not just at the introduction, she's called Ruth the Moabitess, not just Ruth. This is a very important feature, and it helps you to follow along what the author is doing. Why is she called Ruth the Moabitess? Once is enough, twice okay, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, why? Why repeating it over and over again? It means this is important. And for the story of Ruth it is important because if you see what the background is of the Moabites, Moab was born in a very in a situation that wasn't very moral. Lot was in a cave, his daughters wanted progeny, and so they gave him lots of wine and slept with their father. That's how Moab came about, the Moabites. Now we have another story of Ruth. And again, there is an issue of who is she? Is she a real Moabitess? She has that background of sexual immorality, and it plays into the story. And it shows that yes, she does stand up to the test, and she becomes part of the heritage of Israel. But the fact that she's a Moabitess is very crucial to the story. I don't have time to show that all. Another one, in the book of Esther. In the book of Esther there are two important people that are pitched opposite each other. Haman and Mordecai. Haman is called the Agagite. Mordecai is called the son of Kish. Haman is called the Agagite several times, not just once. Haman the Agagite. No, let's see, 3 or 4 times he's called the Agagite. I'm not going to explain why. I'll do that tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll speak here in the church on the book of Esther, and I'll show why this is an important point. The naming of people is very important. It serves, again, the plot, and especially if a name is repeated. It's worth to dig into it, like with Ruth the Moabitess, so also, as I'll show tomorrow, Haman the Agagite. Here, it's also interesting how Bathsheba is named, especially in verse 5. Well, Bathsheba is called actually the wife of Uriah throughout the story. The wife of Uriah. Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. Only once is she called the wife of David, in the very end in chapter 12, after Nathan rebuked David, after David says, yes, I sinned, after his son dies, after he came to Bathsheba again. Then she's called the wife of David. Up until that point, she's always called the wife of Uriah. A very important point, showing that this is not good what David did. Not just Bathsheba, no, Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. So it serves the plot. And I'll explain in a bit more about Bathsheba. So that's the direct way of presenting characters. There's also an indirect way, and that is through acts, as I said. If you want to describe that someone is lazy, you tell what he is doing, or actually what he's not doing. The same here. You wonder, Bathsheba, what was her role in all of this? What was her relationship with Uriah? Did she like him? We don't know. There's a lot that we don't know. We do know one thing, and that is she laments the death of her husband. And that says a lot. So it doesn't mention specifically Bathsheba loved Uriah. It doesn't say that. But in an indirect way, the author describes what is going on. She laments the death. Also, we find David sinning several times. He's almost described as a despot. People call him a despot. Someone who rules with iron fist. Do you say that? Despot. Okay. I'm not from here, meaning not just from Hampton, not from the US. Another way of indirectly describing a character is to contrast one character with another, which is done indirectly. It will never say, David was not like Joab. It will never do that. But if you compare two characters, you can see that there's something going on. And sometimes it's very clear. For example, David and Uriah. To me, when I read this story, it's very clear that the author, on purpose, contrasts them to show something about not just Uriah's character, but also about David's character in this particular story. Uriah, even when drunk, is loyal to the army. What did David do? David didn't even go out to war. In chapter 1, 11, verse 1, it says, In the time that kings go out to war, Joab and his army went to Rabbah, but David stayed at home. Not loyal to that army. Uriah, even when drunk, he's loyal to that army. Second, he controls his sexual urges. He's back, called back home, and David says, well, why don't you go home? Eat, wash your feet, maybe something else. He says, no, I'm loyal to the army, I'll sleep in the gate. Indirectly, this is a way to show the character of David. The complete opposite. Not loyal, not able to control his sexual urges. Uriah is a very loyal servant. He says, my comrades are out in the field, I don't want to go home, I'll sleep in the gate, under the sky. He is so trustworthy that he brings even his own death warrant to the battlefield. He doesn't know. He gets a letter. Who knows what he knew? Because what he says to David, when David says, why don't you go home? He says, why would I go home, lay with my wife? He knew it. He picked up on something that David wanted. And you wonder, as a reader, what did Uriah know? Did he know something, or he didn't? Maybe he didn't. Even in that case, even if he had known, he still brings that letter that he could have opened, looked in it, ran away. He brings it to the general. Of course he didn't know what was in there, but he is such a loyal servant. So here in this parallel, you really see something about David too, about the character of David. So this is done frequently actually in the Bible. Show one character, and through what he does, you see what the other doesn't do. And you see a little bit about the character also of the other. What authors also like to do in the Bible is to show a change, not just a comparison of David and Uriah, also David the first and David the latter. Show change in the person. You see that, for example, in the book of Genesis. Judah, the brother of Joseph, when Joseph comes near, Judah says, why don't we, first he says, why don't we kill him? Then later he comes up with the idea, why don't we sell him to Egypt? Very negative. Hating his brother. In the end, he is the one who stands up for Benjamin, the other son that got many benefits. But you see a change in Judah, and in the middle is a very important chapter that shows why Judah changed, but let's not go into that. But this is done frequently. Show who he was first and who he was later. This is what you also see, I think, here in chapter 11 and 12. David in the beginning, for example, not even caring about the death of some of his soldiers. Joab expected he would be angry, yet he said, oh no, sometimes this happens. It shows his indifference. In chapter 12, he is a different person. As soon as the prophet Nathan confronts him, he says, yes, I sinned. And you see a serious attitude of David fasting for his own son, but also realizing, okay, God has taken him, and I have to accept it. He gets a righteous attitude, a serious attitude. So here also, it's a way of describing a character. Well, I also wrote a speech. Through direct speech, you can also present a character. You can have Joab say, for example, about David. David will get very angry, then you should say this. It presents something about David. We get to know who David is through the speech of Joab. It might not be correct. In this case, it wasn't correct, because David didn't get angry. But who knows, it might show something what he should have reacted if it had been a normal situation. Okay. Three character types. I'm still on this same one. What you can do is you can look at one character, for example David, or Uriah, or Bathsheba, and think about everything you know about that person. And then scholars developed a scale of how to characterize a character. You can call someone round, or flat, or functional. Round means you know a lot about this person, you know a lot about their thought world. Flat means you barely know anything. And then functional, for example, servants are functional, messengers that are sent. They don't really serve in the plot line, they just are sent and they say things. That's it. Now if you look at David, for example, he is a round person. We know a lot about David, a lot about what was going on in him, a lot through, for example, what Job says, how we can get angry. We know a lot about his thought world. A round person. Now look at Bathsheba. What do we know about Bathsheba? We don't really know what she thought. We don't really know what was her attitude when David called for her. We don't know much about about Bathsheba. She is what scholars characterize it as a flat person, flat personality. Now why is that done? Many scholars have thought about the role of Bathsheba. Was she also guilty? She was bathing on the rooftop. Now, if you look at how Bathsheba is presented, I already said she's often called the wife of Uriah. Very important. It shows that David made a mistake. Secondly, for example, in verse 5, 11 verse 5, finally, Bathsheba returns to her home, and then it says, the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. The woman. Now that sounds quite derogatory. And this should not be confused with modern readings often say, well, this is not correct how she's presented. This is not fair. Feminist approaches for it. However, I think the author has chosen on purpose to say the woman, and also call her the wife of Uriah. And the fact that we don't know much about her is purposely done by the author to show that she is not the guilty one. It's not about her. Well, it happened to her, but she is not the guilty one. I think that is what the author wants to stress, and why he lays very low on her character. She doesn't do anything. She's brought. The only thing that she says, the only speech that she's given is, I am pregnant. It all serves that one plot. She is not the guilty one. David bears all the guilt. She is just a woman, an object of desire, in this case. So it's not denigrating. It's to show that she's not the guilty party. Okay. I'll be short on this part. First about time. There's a difference in narrated time and narrative time. Narrated time is the time that it takes for something to happen. For example, if it says Joab sent a messenger to David, well, it probably took about 10 days maybe. That is the narrated time. On the other hand, the narrative time is the amount of words that is dedicated to it. And then you can think in terms of speed. Some stories are very quickly described. The Book of Kings is like that. This king lived 10 years, had 3 sons, wasn't a good king, he died, next king. Very short, but lots of narrated time. The time that it took for that king to live was about 10 years. The writer spends about 2-3 verses on it. Now, as soon as a writer slows down, we know this is more important. For example, in the book of Kings, king after king is described, maybe only one chapter, maybe even less. Suddenly we arrive at Ahab, King Ahab, and the story slows down. And for several chapters, you stay with King Ahab. Still on purpose. Not that Ahab was more important politically, but the author has a purpose of dwelling on this point. Also here in our story, this is important. How much text is spent on a certain issue? You see, for example, that there's more time devoted on the scene of David and Uriah than David and Bathsheba. The moral depravity of David is shown even more so when he kills Uriah, and how he does it. Plus, as I said, the character of David is opposite the character of Uriah, and the author spends time on it to show that difference. It's important to him. Spends a lot of time on it. Then also in the second scene where Uriah and David are speaking, more time is devoted to Uriah's word than David. David doesn't say so much. He says, go home, eat, wash. Uriah is the one who says, how can I live with my wife? If the army is out there, I will be here in the gate. A lot of time is devoted again on Uriah's words. They are the important ones. Now the time slows really down at direct speech, because that is the time it takes to speak. If I say, the man said 2 words, then in that time the man had said 2 words. It's exactly the time as it takes. So then narrated time is exactly like narrative time. So this is how you slow down a story and show the real importance, the real important things. So also with the story of David, for example, his laying with Bathsheba is very short, but then suddenly you have all these direct speeches of Uriah, of Joab, of David. That is the important part. This is where we find where the author lays the stress. Okay. The narrator, I'll be short on this too. He doesn't hide negative aspects of the hero. At least not here in Samuel. He doesn't mind telling what David did and what he did wrong, which is a unique characteristic of ancient literature. He also does it without emotion, which is a little problematic for us. He doesn't immediately say or indicate his anger at David that he did this. He just describes. Sometimes it is a little bit confusing to us, because we think, should this be positively understood? Is this wrong? Is this a moral example for us? Or well, with David it's clear, it's not a moral example. But there are figures in the Bible where it becomes harder to say, is this an example or not? And I'll get to that in a few minutes. Authors also like to use irony. And I'll explain that even more tomorrow, because the book of Esther is full of irony. It is biblical humor. And you have to get to know humor of a different culture, because to us, throwing a pie in someone's face is humor, which is not the type of humor of the Bible. So here you have irony. For example, in 11 verse 7, David asks 3 times, he uses the word shalom 3 times in asking how Job is doing. He's not interested in shalom and peace. But the author puts it 3 times in there, just to show the irony of the situation. Yes, David asking for, how is your shalom? How is the peace going? David was not interested in that. Then also Joab. You wonder if Joab used irony when he uses that example of Abimelech and the woman who threw a stone on the king and killed him. You wonder, is he playing here saying, is a woman involved here? Is this going to be the downfall of a king, you wonder. Irony. Finally, an author often doesn't give value judgment. As I said, that's a little problematic for us. We would like value judgments. We would like to know, is it wrong or is it right what they did? You do find sometimes value judgments. For example, in our story. It's good, I chose a story where there is a value judgment. In the very end of chapter 11, we find, and this was evil in the eyes of the Lord. Which is a funny contrast, ironic contrast, with David's words to Joab. David said to Joab, don't let this be evil in your eyes. The author says, it was evil in the eyes of the Lord. So there we know very clearly what God's position is. And we could have guessed, of course, but in other cases it's harder to guess. Because seldomly does an author give the morale of the story explicitly. And for example, in the book of Esther, there's no explicit morale. You have to find it out through what is the plot, how does the author describe his characters. It's much more indirect and harder. Okay. Finally, application. How would you apply a story like this to your life? We have a tendency to moralize stories. The morale is, don't lay with someone else's wife. Well, I don't know if that was the point of the author. The author spent a very minimal amount of time on what David did with Bathsheba. Is that the point of the story? Is that what the author wanted to bring? Is that what he wanted to say? So this is a problem that is often found. I already mentioned it. It's easy to make characters of the Bible as moral example, but they often aren't a moral example. Or you wonder, should they be a moral example? For example, Gideon, who lays out a fleece to know if the Lord really wants him to go out to war. Is he an example? Is that the way we should behave if we want to know if God wants something of us? Now I'm much more careful. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I said, no, that's not the way. He was a wrong judge. Besides that, God already had told him, you should go out to war. Had confirmed that already. And Gideon just doesn't trust. He just wants another confirmation. It's not the way to be done like that. That time when I said it, someone came to me afterwards and said, he was a missionary, and said, that's the way how we make decisions, always. So now I know I should keep my mouth shut. Because God has His ways of speaking through His Word. And I know that there are ways that I would say they're not how the author has meant it, but I know that God speaks. And so I would never limit it to one point. However, that is on a personal level. I would say the author still has an intention why he wrote the story. And especially if someone is preaching, for example, I would say you have to find what is the point of the author. And from there on, we can go to application. So in this case, it's not just about not laying with someone else's wife, although you see that it all goes downhill from that point that happened. In David's family, all kinds of things go wrong. There is incest, as I said already earlier, Absalom, there's all kinds of weird stuff. Eventually revolts against his father David. So it does show that there is something wrong and that it has consequences. However, as I said, biblical characters aren't always role models. And how would you choose whether he's a role model or not? Abraham had 2 wives. Or Jacob had 2 wives. Is that a role model? We would say, no, of course not. How are we to judge? What if we lived in an African culture where it was normal to have 2 wives? They could say, here we have an example, 2 wives. And that shows that we can't just pick and choose. We can, of course we can. But you see that it is a little problematic to just pick who is your moral example and who not. Because how do we choose? Someone might choose Jacob because of his 2 wives. Is he a moral example? I think the most important question is to ask first, as a background, what does the story tell us about God? It leads us away from moralizing and seeing biblical characters as moral examples, but it asks the question, who is God and how does he relate to us or to this person? Because it gives us an example how God interacts with human beings just like us, with all our faults and mistakes. And from there on we can see how he also reacts to us. For example, the fact that David repents and God agrees and says, okay, you won't need to die. Your son will die, but you don't need to die, is a picture of God's grace. And I think that is a very important point for us to remember. Here is God's grace to the fullest. Someone who has taken the wife of someone else, who has murdered the husband of the other, and yet when he repents, God is gracious. So that is one important point, I think. If we look at what can we learn about God's relationship, how he relates to human beings in this story, this is a very important point. Although you do see the bad consequences. Secondly, we try to find the intention of the author, and the intention of the author is sometimes clarified in the presentation of the characters and the plot, but often, if there is a word of God in a story, that is where we find the intention of the author. So where do we find God's statements? Well, in the last verse of chapter 11, it was evil in the eyes of the Lord. And then in the whole rest of chapter 12. So here first we read about Nathan's rebuke, which is clearly God's perspective. This is wrong, what David did. And then it's very interesting to read exactly how this is described. Because this is an important part, and this is where you find what God's reaction is. Therefore it's important. Let's read a few verses. I won't read the whole parable that Nathan gave. I'll read what Nathan says after the parable. Chapter 12, verse 7. Nathan said to David, "You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom. And I gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight?" And then it explains what he does. I think this is where we find the most important point of the author, the message that the author wanted to present. The fact that God had given a lot, and David despised what God had given. I think you could put it like this. David actually should have accepted what the grace of God had given him and be thankful for that. That's the point. I gave you kingship, I gave you the house of Saul, I gave you his wives, I gave you control over Israel and Judah. he didn't take that from the hand of God, not with thankfulness. Instead, he despised it. So he should have accepted what the grace of God had given him, and also what the grace of God had not given him, or actually what God had taken away from him, and that is his child. And only in the end of the story he realized that David came to that conclusion. He still begs for the life of his own son. But as soon as his child dies, he washes and gets up and accepts what God had taken away. So I think that this is a very important point, which is also focused on in the chiasm that I had shown earlier. The chiasm where you see, let's go back, this one, oh, this one, where you see that this is in the middle. The servant's wondering, well, David might flip out. He doesn't flip out. He accepts finally what God had given him and what God hadn't given him, which is opposite to what Nathan said earlier. You despised what God had given you. And I think this is the most important point of the story, shown throughout the text in these points, but even clarified in what Nathan says as a prophet, as God's own word. He should have accepted what the grace of God had given him, and also what the grace of God had taken, in this case his child, and that is what he does in the end. And I think if you put it like that, it is fairly easy to make an application to our time from that main point. Accepting what God's grace gives, for example. Accepting it with thankfulness and not despising it. Thinking about what God has given us and being thankful for that. Also, another point. You see that when he failed to walk with God, he brought his life, family, and career, or maybe even his country, in danger. So from here, you can go to the application. Thankfulness for what God has given, and also when we fail to walk with God, we are walking on the edge of the abyss. On the other hand, as I said earlier, we also learn about how God relates to people. And we see here God's enormous grace being very active. So this is what I think you learn from a story like this. Not just moralizing, not just saying this is how you shouldn't behave. Here is a point that is probably much more closer to us. Accepting what God's grace has given us and what he hasn't given us. And this is what you learn in a small story like that. Yet, of course, it falls within a bigger story on David. And I already showed that from this point on, the upwards flow of David's career suddenly goes all down. So even though, yes, God is gracious to him, even gives him a new child, even calls the child my beloved, yet it's not all happy what happens afterwards. I think these are the things we can learn from a story like this. Okay. That's it. I hope I gave you a little indication of how stories work. And that you see that there is much more going on in a story than is written in our children Bibles. But it's also much more interesting. And that's why I think it's good to read with more than one person. I always appreciate it if I read a text with other people, because it slows me down in reading. People notice different things. Here's a repetition. This seems to be important for the author. It always helps, and I think that's also important. Okay.
Any questions for me?
Well, when Bathsheba tells David that she's pregnant, has realized the difficult spot she's in because at that time, adultery was not treated finally. Would she have faced being stoned?
I heard especially the last part. You said if Bathsheba.
When Bathsheba told David that she was pregnant, she was showing that she realized the precarious position she was in because the laws were very strict about adultery. And everyone knew where her husband was, and he wasn't with her. So that was then in his camp. He was also in dire straits.
Uriah or David or Bathsheba?
David, both of them.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
she's admitted that, when she told him she was pregnant, she was admitting that she was in a very difficult position.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good point. That also Bathsheba realizes that maybe she and David are in a precarious position. However, the author only says that Bathsheba says, I am pregnant. We don't know anything about other things that she says. And I think that pushes the direction to blaming David much more than Bathsheba. If the author wanted to focus on also the problem for Bathsheba and the background of the law, he could have put that in there too. Instead, I think he chooses here to say the least about it, only I am pregnant, to show that David is the one who is in the fault. But you're right, in reality, they were in a very precarious position. It's a good point.
Any other questions?
Okay, some of what I have described, for example, the chiasms, are quite complex, and I can imagine that you think, how in the world could I find something like that in the text? I didn't find it myself, I'll be honest. Sometimes I do find things like that. If I see repetition, for example, I think, well, maybe there's something going on here. I learned it from other sources, so that's where you learn also from a community. But what you can learn is reading careful, seeing repetitions, for example, seeing where does the author lay his focus. And I think that is something that we can learn. And then if there are these intricate structures, we learn that from maybe Sermon, other people that always bring things like that to the table.
For those of us who are going to a different church tomorrow, are you going to take these? Or not tomorrow, then? Check it out.
Yeah.
So we can come.
Yeah, if you want to hear about Esther.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry for those who I left in the dark for tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yes.
It'll be recorded though. Yeah, on the website.
I some of the points that you hit on in how we teach children these stories. Is there other things that we need to follow this process a little bit more?
That is,
Or
yeah, that's the best question. That's a very good question. I have a son. He's only half a year old, but I'm also looking at children's Bibles. And I have to say, some children's Bibles tend to moralize and say these are examples, like Samson, for example. I don't know if Samson was an example. I don't know if I want my child to see Samson as an example. Maybe it's more about, despite his failures, God still works with him and through him. But I don't know if I want him to be my hero in the children's Bible. But to find a good children's Bible, I realize it's not easy. So I don't know how I would do it. I know in some places there are very good descriptions of biblical stories. We like to use the book of Jonah as an example, whether we like children's Bible or not, because the story of Jonah is often presented as God said to Jonah, go to Nineveh. He didn't want to, went on a ship, They tossed him overboard. A fish swallowed him, and then he went to Nineveh. And I think if you read the book of Jonah, you realize it's not about the fish. It's not even so much about whether he went to Nineveh or not. It is really about the heart of Jonah. In the end of the book of Jonah, that's the final question. It is, why would I be gracious? And the question is to Jonah. And I think that is the whole point of the book of Jonah. It is fighting for Jonah's heart and who Jonah is. And God wants to see Jonah change, not just Nineveh. And I always look at children's Bibles, and I think, well, let's see if they bring it up. Because I think it's fairly clear in the book of Jonah, especially the last chapter. It's all about that. And I realize that children's Bibles often leave out the whole last chapter. And I wonder why. On the other hand, VeggieTales, I heard that VeggieTales has a very good rendition of the Jonah story. So here, there are sources that are very good. And in this case, I heard it, I haven't seen it yet. But I heard that Jonah is very well done in the VeggieTales. So what I like to do is, I like to read in the book of Jonah myself and then see if a children's Bible represents that or not. And some do. Some are very well done and describe the whole book of Jonah instead of only presenting him as an example. But it still is a very good question, and if you have good suggestions, I would love to hear.
I think even beyond that, what about curriculum? I even look around, we've got a lot of teachers here that on Sunday morning, I love to bring this depth to my Sunday school class, but to be honest, I don't have the time
True.
to do anything but to turn it into a moral lesson, to be honest.
Yeah.
And it's still a good lesson,
No.
David and Bathsheba, it's still a bad idea. I mean, it's something that needs to be taught,
Yeah.
even if it isn't the,
You're right, and that's why I would never say that, you can't say that God doesn't speak there. You're right, it is right that it still is the story that this is completely wrong and children can learn from it.
So how do we teach that bigger context in a Sunday school to fifth graders?
Well, how many times, the person who came up with the catechism, how many times do you think they've read the story of David before they got to all that
True.
detail? You know, the kids in Sunday school are hearing it the very first time, they're
Yeah.
getting the basic pieces of the story, and then it's, as you grow older, hear it over and over and study it and read it
You're
over
right.
and over, that you start.
You're right. So it builds. You're right. You can't tell the kids about a chiasm, for example. They would be bored if you are in A. You haven't even got to B or C. So you're right. You present basics. You can't tell everything. So I like that. That's a very good point. But then I do like, for example, a VeggieTales that presents the whole story of Jonah, that describes even the last important chapter. But that's individual stories where you realize, oh yeah, I really like this, how it's presented.
Well, why don't we dismiss from here, and there's more refreshments over there, so if you want to hang out for a while, talk a little bit, talk a little David and Bathsheba, one more time with me. So let's thank you too for coming and sharing with us.